Thank you very much, and welcome to this very important session. The US presidential election is only 3 weeks away, and that's going to be a moment of truth for so many of us. And so it's definitely a great timing that we discuss the global economic and geopolitical impacts of the US election results. Much was discussed already in the opening plenary session with Bill and all the others as well. But let's focus more on to the detail with the great panelists we have today here in Tokyo, and also from New York, Joshua, and also from Prague. And so it's a different time zone. Thank you very much all for joining us. And we will focus on how the shift in the US foreign policy, trade policy, and regulatory environments might affect the global markets and also to the geopolitics. So we do cover wide-ranging issues. But first of all, I think we definitely need to know what is really happening in the United States. And I think that Glen is among best person to offer the viewpoints. So with the U.S. election is less than months away, and Glen, what should we be paying close attention in this final stage of the election campaign, and what could be the key factors driving the result?
Well, thank you, Ken, and thanks to GLOBIS for organizing this interesting and important panel discussion. So there are two things I'd like to mention in the 3 minutes I have. The first is to bring you up to date on the public opinion polling. The 538 polls, the Real Clear Politics polls, have had Kamala Harris leading last week with about 2.5% and 2.0%, but Trump is catching up. Yesterday, ABC News and NBC News reported that what used to be about a 5-point lead is now narrowed to 2 points for Kamala Harris in one poll. And the NBC News poll released yesterday shows that the gap was 5% in favor of Harris, but now it's 0, neck and neck. It's even between the two. But obviously we know that the overall national polls are not determinative of the electoral college results, so everything depends on the 7 battleground states. If we look in detail at Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada, constituting 50 electoral votes, Kamala Harris is ahead, anywhere from 0.3 to 0.7. But Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina, totaling 43 electoral votes, Donald Trump is ahead. So it really is an even battle. And as you know, the margin of error in these polls is about 2.3% to 2.5%. So any of these could be off, just in terms of methodology. So I think from the standpoint of the public opinion polling, it's impossible to tell. So I'm going to switch to the second thing, which is the question that you've asked about the key factors. I think there are 5 factors that I'm watching. First is the economy, immigration, and abortion, because economy and immigration are areas in which Trump is considered to be strong, but actually on the economy, Kamala Harris is catching up, and therefore it appears the Trump people are focusing more on immigration. That's the key issue that they're focusing on now. The Democrats, Kamala Harris in particular, are focusing on abortion, trying to get the women vote, the turnout to go up. The second is natural disasters. We've had hurricanes that have been politicized, the Trump people in particular criticizing the Biden-Harris administration for not adequately dealing with the natural disasters, especially in Florida, Georgia, North Carolina. The third set of factors is foreign affairs. Just yesterday, it's been announced the U.S. is sending 100 troops and supplying THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Battery missiles to Israel. This poses the possibility of the U.S. getting more engaged in the Middle East, which could split the Democratic Party more, and it could lead to greater attacks on the administration by both the left and the right. Number 4 factor is October surprise. As we all recall, 2016, October 28, 2016, James Comey, FBI director, came out with the statement that they were reopening the investigation about Hillary Clinton's emails, and that, according, I think Hillary Clinton has concluded that cost her the election. There are new revelations about Donald Trump, especially with the Bob Woodward book about the relationship with Vladimir Putin. And also Mark Milley, former head of Joint Chiefs of Staff, has said that Donald Trump is the most dangerous American, and therefore that kind of revelations about Trump could affect the outcome. And finally, it's Russia, China, North Korea, Israel, they all are rooting for Trump. And so to what extent any of these are going to be undertaking attempts to favor Trump and disadvantage Harris. So those are the 5 factors I'm looking at.
Well, thank you. That's a great setting up the tone. And I'd like to pass over to Joshua on the similar sets of the question. And I think you are also watching this presidential campaign very closely, and would like to ask what's your take on this, and especially you're looking at the U.S.-Japan relationship more closely than anybody else. Is there anything that the Japanese have been overlooking in a way that presidential campaign has been taking place? Any kind of like a shift of the U.S. society priorities and agendas that Japanese audiences may need to look at?
Great. Thank you, Ken, and so many of my friends for this conversation. I'm going to be very brief, like Glenn did as well. It's clear to me that we're all missing a lot. As Glenn just laid out, this is going to be the closest election we've ever seen. And I think this is probably the most divided America we've ever seen. And so when I watch the Japanese press, the discussion about Moshi Tora and Hobo Tora, all that misses the point. I think in many ways, Japanese are far too rational and clear-minded when it comes to politics, because you're looking at it from the outside. This is an emotional battle that's taking place right now for the heart and soul of America. And in many ways, no matter who wins on November 5th, the one point I want to make is we will not know who the president is on November 5th. Unlike Japan, which on October 27th, probably at 9 p.m., we will all know who the prime minister is and by how much and how much the LDP lost and what that means for Yeshiba. In America, we're not going to know. And I think because of those 7 battleground states, because of how contentious this election is, even if it is beyond the margin of error that Glenn explained, I think there's going to be a lot of emotion on the table. This country is divided. No matter who wins, is going to really have to work very hard to bring everyone together. What we saw with the LDP election, with Yeshiba trying to bring people together, that was pretty unusual. They're not back together yet. There's still big divides. And so I think we're looking at 2 countries that are closer than we've ever seen, and a president and a prime minister, no matter who they are, that are going to work more closely together. But that doesn't mean that we're going to be strong or unified as our countries. In many ways, the U.S.-Japan relationship will be much stronger than the internal feelings of most Americans from a Democratic Republican point of view, and probably even our LDP friends in Japan, depending on how things go. So I guess the bottom line for me is that in many ways, foreign policy has had no role in the election, except as the way Glenn described it. We've got 2 major wars taking place that are both generally regional in Ukraine and the Middle East. Obviously, the big area that everyone should be focused on is what's happening in Japan's neighborhood. And in that case, Japan has a huge role to play. And whoever becomes president after 2025 in January, whoever comes in, it's got a big host of problems, and trying to contain those problems requires Japan. The challenge here, of course, is I don't believe that the president and the prime minister alone can make those decisions. In many ways, as a democracy, it's more complicated. In an autocracy, an authoritarian state, one leader, one dear leader, Vladimir Putin, others can make the decision. Xi can do his own thing. Here, whether it's Harris or Trump, Yeshiba or somebody else, we need the private sector, we need business leaders, we need society, like many of you. So I think in this case, we are really at the mercy of all of us coming together to hopefully overcome the domestic political challenges. So let me leave it right there, Ken, for the first round, and we'll come back beyond that.
Joshua, thank you very much. That was very powerful, I think, assessment of what's been happening in the United States and implication for U.S.-Japan relationship. Now turn over to Jagannath. And Jagannath is a great expert on the foreign policy of India, but he also studies a lot about the Asia, Japan, and all the kind of regional transaction. And now he is based in Stockholm, so it's a kind of a cross regional kind of specialist that I expect many comments from you, Jagannath. But I think first I'd like to ask from India's perspective, and what aspects of the U.S. election are most significant for India, and how do you see the U.S.-India relationship affected by the potential change of the U.S. administration's foreign policy focus, particularly Indo-Pacific? Over to you.
Thank you, Ken. Great to be here, and thank you very much for this invitation to speak to this informed audience. I think there are three critical issues from India's point of view. One is that whether it's the Democrats, Republicans, I think India is prepared to deal any new president that the United States of America will have. And while saying that, I think the kind of continuation is happening in India-US relations for the last 10 to 15 years or last 2 decades. There is a positivity out of this that no matter what would be the outcome of the US election, that will not disrelay, that would not really disturb the continuity or the momentum that India-US relationship has got all these years. While saying that, I think there is one factor which will play critical role is the 4.9 million Indian Americans who actually constitute 1.35% of the American population. Now, if we talk about these Indian Americans, they are divided. As our earlier panel speaker was speaking, the way US politics is divided today, these Indian Americans are also equally divided. There is a chunk amount of populations who are supporting the Democrats, given that Kamala Harris is having a strong Indian link. And so therefore, ideally, in India, government would like to see the continuation of the Democrats in power and the win of Kamala Harris. But while saying that, probably India is also prepared for the surprise. If Trump wins or the Republicans wins, probably India would not really take it as a big surprise, given the fact that the way he won the last election. So therefore, I think the Indian American diaspora populations are going to play a big role no matter who wins the election. The third issue is that there are a lot of economic and critical issues between India and US are there, which India would like to settle it as soon as possible. For example, there are trade and WTO disputes, which is ongoing for a long time. Of course, we had one last bit of a WTO disputes on the tariff issues, which has been more or less settled. But India would not like that if there is a Republican president coming or Trump is coming, India would not like that these disputes again go back to its own courts and then revive in some form or the other. So these are basically three issues that India would look. But I think overall Indian people would like to see Democrats coming to power, particularly Kamala Harris, given the issue that she's having a strong Indian background. One final point is that I think the immigration issue and the visa issue, as you know, it's a big Indian population every year, coming to US. I think we would like to see how the new president, new administration looking at some of these issues. We saw during the Donald Trump's tenure, there were very, very much heated argument between the Republicans and the Indian government, that is Modi government, on the visa issue. But some of these issues should not be affecting the overall India relations, no matter who wins the Indian US elections in a few months.
Well, thank you, Jagannath. That's a very comprehensive perspective from India. And I just came back from the Silicon Valley and I find out that those of the leaders of the tech companies, many of them are the Indian origins, and it's really drive the like a tech revolutions in many sectors. And if the kind of the countries opening up, closing down policy for those immigration, either the high skill, medium skills, and that will really change the kind of dynamics of the ecosystem as well. And India provides one of the key components of that. So I'll come back to those issues later. But before, Takako, and I think everybody's very interested in what you say about how Japan is preparing for the result of the election and how prepared we are, and what has been your take so far.
Thank you so much, Ken. I think people were curious to know what you think about how Japan is preparing for what happens after the election, but let me try to do my stab at this. So there was a lot of articles written about the possible return of Trump, the Moshitora phenomenon. And then there were a political season within Japan that we had our election in September and we're having an election in October. And I think we're at this point where we just have to wait and see. And the US election is happening right after the Japanese election. As Josh said, we probably wouldn't know the winner for a while. But I think what's most important, I think, in thinking about what the election might affect, how it might affect Japan, is that it's probably not going to be the bilateral question. I don't think it's going to be the alliance. Because I was reading a piece that I wrote in 2017 about how Japan tries to manage Trump. I wrote that in Foreign Affairs, and I said Japan will try to disarm and disengage. But I felt almost nostalgic because the world has changed so much that it's really not about whether Trump will be critical to Japan. It's more about how the world will change and how the U.S. foreign policy is and how, although U.S. might be still capable relative to other countries, is it going to have the willingness to engage in a world that as we know it? And if it's going to be changing, I think it's going to be in a more unpredictable, radical direction if it's Donald Trump. And we can probably expect to see some continuity or most continuity if it's Harris, but whether it's going to turn out the same, whether it's Ukraine or Gaza or Taiwan, we just don't know. So I think how Japan can prepare is really not about who's going to be president, but more about what Japan can do in the region. And I think is to be the stable, reliable, but flexible and resilient partner for the U.S. in the region. And I think since there's almost no discussion, as you said, John, I've been watching the debates quite closely, waiting for something to be said about Asia, but not really, and not even China. So it's just hard to prepare for what, because it's really not on the table. And it also will depend on who joins the administration, who's going to be the team, whether it's going to be, what kind of team it's going to be. It's a little bit easier to expect for Harris. But still, for Trump, we just don't know which direction it's going to go. So I think we just need to be the reliable partner and a partner that could reach out to what should be U.S. partners, even if U.S. itself doesn't reach out to those countries. So I'm here.
That's wonderful, Takako. And long time ago, the former ambassador of Japanese ambassador to the United States, always said that the U.S. presidential election result is like a Christmas present. After you open it, you have to say, "This is what I wanted." But seems to be that the current sense is more, it's those kind of fantasy period is seemingly over. Something that we really need to seriously prepare for what kind of configuration of the changes that the United States try to deal with the world. And that will be still the single most important, I think, factor that we need to seek over. So in that context, I like to ask Jagannath and Joshua in this order about how do we need to prepare for the post-election and what the world might look like after the U.S. elections come, because we are still facing with two big wars in Europe and also in the Middle East. It could have so many different scenarios that might affect cross-regional, international relations as well, and also India, as mentioned, that some people in India may prefer Trump because, as opposed to what the Jagannath says, because that the Trump may accelerate the so-called multipolar world, which India may have more room to play. And that could also be the kind of perception that India can really develop. But Jagannath, the big questions, what might be, the key factors that you may think that India, also South Asia, emerging economies are now looking at after the election?
I think there are a couple of issues. One is that if you see, Ken, over the last few years, particularly from Donald Trump's win in the last election, there is this first analogy is very much visible in every political constituency of the countries. America first, India first, Japan first, China first. So every country are holding to their first kind of slogan in their foreign policy and national issues. And I think in that context, it would be really suicidal if we continue to see that kind of first analogy after the US election, which is very much a possibility if Trump's win. Now, you alluded to the fact that in India, some people might see Trump coming back to power, which is true. But again, as I mentioned, the Indian population, like the Indian Americans in US, they are equally divided. Here, a couple of issues will decide whether India would like to see Trump coming back to power or not. One is to what extent the Republicans, or let's say the Trump, is looking at China, looking at Russia, and looking at North Korea. Those are critical issues. For India, probably Trump's approach to North Korea or US approach to North Korea does not matter much, because we do have a good cordial relations with North Korea, even though we had shut down our embassy in North Korea. But I think the fact of the matter here is that Trump wants to have a good relationship with China, with Russia, and particularly with Xi Jinping and Putin. That is a worrisome factor for India, because India-US relationship is moving forward in the Indo-Pacific. And nobody would like to see a disruption in that. And I think given the kind of understanding is emerging on the greater Indo-Pacific environment involving Quad to minilateral groupings through Indian Ocean, and particularly the defense exchanges and security partnerships, nobody would like to disturb that. The second issue is, I think the more complex is the trade and economic issues. We know that US had imposed a lot of tariffs on imports of steel and aluminum products from India. Those are critical issues because the trade is still imbalanced between US and India. And Trump is a transactional leader. He brings business to his presidency. So therefore, some Indian businessmen will be worried. And this might also affect Indian approach to the US, Indian government's approach to the new American administration. So Trump brings both issues to the table, good things and bad things, and we have to see how he's looking at the world. But again, I'm not really worried about the future of India-US relationship. No matter who wins, I think India-US relationship is in a stable path of progress, and I think that progress will continue to be there.
Thank you, Jagannath. That's great. I think what really alters the result of the U.S. election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump is all about the predictability for the future. We can probably assume more continuity than changes in the Harris administration, but there are so many potential elements that goes back and forth in the Trump administration. Whoever who is confident to navigate that kind of changes and seek as an opportunity, that's great. And especially you can find those from those authoritarian states that may seek a chance to overturn the positions in the world. But many of those like-minded states, that's a huge issue upon us. So Joshua, you mentioned a lot about good things about how Japan-US relationship has evolved in the past decades, and seeing that how Abe, Suga, Kishida has reached out to Washington D.C. and developed so many confidence and the leveling up of the relationship both on the security and economic front. Seemingly that we are in the good shape, but I wonder that this good shape is really sufficient for dealing with the future affairs, and that is as you mentioned that during the presidential election, there's lots of things in the world that is left untouched, and the world is changing all days. And looking from your perspective, how much the potential that the Japan-U.S. relationship can really evolve together to deal with those emerging issues, and how much you are concerned about the current trends of dealing with those issues?
Yeah, I mean, Ken, I want to just pick up on your analogy, and I've heard Ambassador Fujisaki use that term a lot about a Christmas gift. And the trouble, of course, is that this isn't Christmas anymore. No one is going to be happy with the present that is given to you this time around. Americans aren't happy with the choices. I don't think the world is happy with the choices. So I think it is time in many ways to move beyond the Cold War mentality of Japan being the little brother. I think, as Takako was mentioning, I think Japan needs to focus on what it can do to be a great partner, not just to the United States, but to world peace and stability. We're seeing in the Middle East right now what a post-American world looks like. America is supporting Israel, as Glen was mentioning, but I don't think most Americans are fully on board with what's going on, nor do we want to have a dog in this fight. Most Americans do not want to see escalation in Ukraine or in the Middle East, even if our sympathies may be with one side or the other, because I think in many ways, Americans are tired of playing that global role from a security perspective. But I think the key point here from a Japanese point of view, as you said, is stability. I'll be brutally honest. I think that in many ways, a Trump 2.0, we know what that looks like. We know exactly how Donald Trump acts. We know exactly what needs to be done. And Japan is very good at that. We saw that with Prime Minister Abe. And I think many people in Japan give Prime Minister Abe a lot of credit personally for the way he navigated Donald Trump. I actually think you should give more credit to the Japanese bureaucrats and those who are part of that system, because no matter who wins on November 5th and how long it takes, I think that the Prime Minister of Japan should be on the first plane to make sure that they're meeting with the new president of the United States, because that personal diplomacy matters, and the way in which the Christmas wrapping you're talking about matters is good from a diplomatic point of view. But you need to be preparing for a world in which Japan has to take on more responsibility. The American population isn't interested in many ways. When you talk about the economic side of the equation, America's not coming back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership anytime soon. And if Donald Trump comes in, you need to change the terms from TPP to TRUMP. Then he might join that again. But I think the key point there in many ways is thinking about how Japan, from an economic security perspective, how Japan can play a role in terms of semiconductors and AI. And I think in that case, you have a major ally in the United States in terms of the different partners, but you have crazy things happening like the Nippon Steel case, which makes no rational sense. But because of the election year, Japan in many ways is treated just like China. And that cannot happen in a world in which we need to be very clear about who our allies are and where we can have free and open systems so that our economic systems can continue to flourish, because that's the strength of America. That's the strength of Japan. And so for me, I agree very much with what's been said. The U.S.-Japan relationship can't solely rely on a Washington-Nagatocho area. You mentioned, Ken, you're in Silicon Valley. I'm in New York. I think in many ways, these capitals of innovation and finance are driven more by money and more by opportunity than by politics, which often, once going back to what I said earlier, goes back to emotions versus rationality. And so I think the U.S.-Japan relationship is the most important in the world as you look at what's going to happen between the U.S. and China, what could happen in this region. And when you think about Japan's leadership already with the Indo-Pacific and others, I think we need more of Japan on the global stage. That's not natural for Japan. Japan doesn't want to, in many ways, do that. They like to hide and let the Americans be the bad guys and the bad cop with the security. I think in this world, we're going to have to support each other. And I think that's, in many ways, what I see my role and many of our friends' role to help the Japanese see that we need you more than ever, because for a while, we're going to be focusing internally. You're not going to hear us talk about Asia very much. So that's kind of my response to what we just talked about, Ken.
Joshua, that's fascinating. I'd like to turn over to Takako, that Japan is also having a general election October 27th, and the current state of political structure in Japan is not as stable as what we have in past 5 to 10 years. And at the time that we really need to have an innovative response to the the result of the election, Abe went to the Trump Tower, much earlier than any G7 leaders tried to engage Trump. He tried to gain the personal credit from him. And then that, Trump trusted Shinzo so much on every issue that the Trump seems to be, rely on him. And that is great credit for Japan during the Trump administration. One of the rare success stories that Japan's, the leader has engaged in. And Kishida also, made a speech at the U.S. Congress and addressing to the current state affairs in the United States. As Joshua mentioned, United States has been tired of engaging worldwide, and Japan should be the one who needs to, share those kind of perspective to increase our the capability to so those are really kind of resonate with inside a U.S.-Japan dynamics. But how do you see that anything could happen from the new administration, and what's your prospect on this?
Thank you, Ken. You gave me the hard one, and I would like to turn it back to you. But let me just say that you're right that I think the Kishida "You're Not Alone" speech at the U.S. Congress was very important. But how exactly to actually be that partner or friend? Japan has to do its own homework, because I think the message was good, but how to actually be that friend is still a heavy task that we haven't looked at. But thinking about the Japanese political season, you're right that we are having an election. I don't think anybody thinks that the LDP is going to be out of power, but it's true that I think they already expect that they're going to lose seats. And I think more importantly, in the upper house election in July, that we're seeing, we may have a divided government again. And so it might not be as stable as what we saw during the Trump administration or during the Abe administration. And also, we're not too sure anybody plays golf in the current administration. And I don't think Donald Trump needs any more golf clubs either. So what do we do if it is Trump? And even if it's Harris, I think we just have to do what we can do. And the given is almost that, as Josh said, the US is really not going to be around Asia, or may not be in a way that we used to expect. And to start from there, do what we can do, given the set of organizations we belong to and commitments we have made. So I do think it was extremely important that after the quite intense election happening within the LDP, that Prime Minister Shiba, the first thing he did was go to the ASEAN countries. And he said that we cannot allow for unilateral change of status quo by force in this region. And that's something that the U.S. could have said, but the U.S. did not have President Biden, obviously. So Japan doing what it can do. Also, Ishiba met with the Chinese leader. And so in a way, I think it was good that he is doing what should be done. And at the meeting with the Chinese officials, he said that we need to have a multi-layer decision-making process, coordination or something like that, which I think is important. So what I think we could do, even given the fact that maybe we're not going to have a leader like Mr. Abe, I do think that maybe the politics have changed. Internal workings of politics have changed within the LDP. There was sort of a regime shift, but I'm happy to see that there seems to be more policy continuation, and there seems to be more stability now in that side. So there's going to be some political internal change, and I'm not too sure if I'm in the position to predict that, but I think the policy continuation has been recovered, I think. And so I'm hopeful that Japan does what it can do, maybe not doing what the US can do, but definitely playing a role in Asia in a way that we wanted US to play, but is probably no longer at least for the time being.
Great, Takako. And Glenn, I think you have plenty of things that you want to say here, but especially we are with lots of business leaders, both in Japan and the United States, and they are very concerned about the potential outcomes of the U.S. election might change the whole business environments that they plug and play. Trump, whether true or not, that he will impose 60% of tax against China and the 10% all over the world. definitely changed the kind of state of action in the trade and investment policies. And I think that, it's a bipartisan things that the United States emphasize on more onto the industrial policy inside, more internal restrictions on the investments and, export and trade, high-tech transfers, and, things surrounding economic security has been the state of play for almost like 5-7 years. And Glenn, well, what's your viewpoint? How this trend might affect after the election?
Well, I think that if Trump wins, then clearly there's going to be a change from the Biden-Harris administration in areas like dealing with international organizations, including NATO, WTO, and others, environment, energy, and climate change policies, national security, trade, investment, immigration. And if Project 2025 is going to have any influence in the Trump administration, the whole nature of the federal government, the relation between the federal government and state governments, and usually when there's a new administration that comes into office, about 4,000 people come in to assume senior positions, of whom about 1,200 require Senate confirmation. But apparently, former President Trump believes that one of the reasons he wasn't able to do what he wanted in the first term was because of the deep state that prevented him. And therefore, I think Project 2025 assumes that there will be about 10,000 people coming in who will pledge loyalty to the president down to the office of a level of office director, as well as deputy assistant secretary. So there could be some very significant changes. And so that obviously requires some flexibility on the part of those who might be affected. I can talk in more detail in the Q&A period. But the second thing I wanted to mention is that I think a lot of people assume that if Kamala Harris becomes president, that there will be significant continuity from the Biden administration. I actually think that there may not be as much continuity as a lot of people assume. And the reason for that is that having known Kamala Harris since 2016, when she ran for the Senate, and having been on her foreign policy advisory team in 2019, when she was running to be president, my sense is that Kamala Harris comes from a totally different background from Joe Biden. I mean, Kamala Harris, California, it's like one of the most diverse states in the country. It's number 5 in the world in terms of economic scale, but it has prospered based on trade, investment, and immigration. And also, she has very close ties with people in Silicon Valley. So I actually think that there may be more changes than many people expect when it comes to a Kamala Harris administration. Plus, her mother's from India, her father's from Jamaica. She's a much more open-minded person and a global person. However, it's true at the same time, she doesn't have much experience in foreign policy or economic issues. So my third point is that in the case of the Trump administration, I think that we all know that Trump is going to be making most of the important decisions. So it's going to be important, as in the past, to deal with Trump. You can't necessarily expect that people around him are going to persuade him and convince him. In the case of Kamala Harris, because she doesn't have a lot of experience on economic issues and foreign policy, who she appoints to be Secretary of State, NSC Director, or a Secretary of Commerce or Treasury or Defense is going to be extremely important. So I think from the Japanese point of view, as well as other allies, in the case of a Harris administration, dealing with her obviously is important as president, but dealing with her advisors is going to be extremely important because they will play a much bigger role in the administration than the advisors in a Trump administration. So I guess those are 3 points. If Trump wins, if Harris wins, and the need to deal with Kamala Harris's senior officials, because she'll be relying a great deal on them with regard to economic as well as foreign policy issues.
Sure. Quick question. How about the Congress? I mean, the result of the Congress may constrain or...
No, that's a very important point. I should have mentioned that the Senate right now is 51-49, but because Joe Manchin is not running, West Virginia will certainly go Republican, which means it'll be 50-50. Jackie Rosen in Nevada, John Tester in Montana, Sherrod Brown in Ohio, Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, and then Maryland probably will be okay, but Larry Hogan is running. He's a very popular governor. So there are 5 states, and where it's very close race, and if the Democrats lose even one, then it'll become a Republican majority, and that has implications not only for passing legislation, but also especially in terms of personnel, because if the president nominates somebody, if the Senate is the same party, it's much easier to get those nominees confirmed. But if there's even one majority on the other side, then in the case of Biden, he actually had to withdraw a number of people because he wasn't able to get even some of the Democrats to support. The House, it looks like it probably, I think a lot of people believe that it will flip to be Democratic, but the Senate is going to be very difficult to maintain the majority. So I think it's likely to be a Republican Senate and a Democratic House. And so whichever president comes in, becomes president, will have to deal with a split Congress.
Great. So I think this topic is the topic for everyone, and so I'd like to expand the Q&A session a bit. And now I'd like to open the floor for everybody to join in the discussion. I'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then hopefully we can have 2 or 3 rounds on this. Anybody who wish to raise a question? Yes, gentleman there, and then gentleman in the back.
Thank you for the discussion. So I'm from JICT, Japanese ICT funds working for the MIC. And my question is that about the international organizations, you have already touched on a little bit. So now, because of the two wars is going on, that U.S. seems to be criticized really having a double standard that. So now the China and Russia, the other BRICS countries, really seems to make up the new international order. So what's the U.S. really stance would be in the next administrations?
Great. Okay. So gentleman in the back, please.
Sorry. The Haru Hirate from Dentsu Group. My question is about divided society in the United States. I have American sister-in-law and discussion around within my family. I don't want to see the United States divided. The US, in my view, is like a model for the democracy and justice. So from Japan viewpoint, the US should be the good model for it. Rather than talking about the Democrats or Republicans, but how to integrate the United States, I'd like to hear.
Okay. Any other one? Okay, please, Kaji-san.
Kaji from Cinnamon AI. I'm interested in the reaction from the U.S. community regarding that statement from that Ishiba-san regarding Japan-U.S. status of force agreement and Asian version of NATO.
Okay, so I think at Josh, you have many coverage of those topics: international organization, divided society in the United States, Ishiba's specific preference policy. So you may start.
Great. Ken knows I sit across the street from the United General Assembly at the Japan Society, and I have to say I've been watching with horror with what Glen already mentioned about the kind of the diminishing role of international organizations. This year at the UN, only President Biden of the Quad leaders came, even though the Quad leaders met only 2 hours down the road in Wilmington. So Prime Minister Kishida didn't come, Modi didn't come, and the Australian. So I think in many ways, this is not just about any one particular international organization. I happen to agree with Glen, who basically said, if it's Trump, it's going to be even worse. But I tend to think that America in general is pulling back from international organizations because these were created in the aftermath of World War II. They're not working anymore. It's basically, we look at China and Russia, and they don't have to play by the rules. And here we are stuck debating them at the UN General Assembly and the Security Council. And I think in the case of NATO, this ties directly to the question about Ishiba-san's suggestions. Look, I believe strongly that Japan needs to play a more significant role. I think that Japan should be appreciated for stepping up and doubling its security funding. And in many ways, this is going to happen one way or the other. And it's better that Japan do it on its own terms than get into a transaction, because we know Trump told us last time Japan's not paying enough. If Trump comes back, he's going to be very hard on Japan. I think Japan needs to be prepared for that. I think in general, most people in the United States kind of followed Ishiba's comments about Asian NATO, and they didn't really know what to make of it. But I think in general, they kind of said, well, the LDP will figure things out. They must have a better idea here. And I think even the Ishiba administration immediately said, well, this is an idea for the future, not for right now. I think there's too many other things going on. And this gets to the heart of the question about division. I agree with the question about the importance of unity, but I have to tell you, the way that you prepare is preparing for the worst. So you don't ever bet against America. I think in many ways, I don't want to be misinterpreted. I am speaking as a deep friend of Japan, that I want you to be prepared, because I think sometimes Japanese think Americans are much bigger and much more powerful than we actually are. We are human, and we have a lot of emotions. We have a lot of challenges right now. And so I think you're going to have to be patient with us. And I think in many ways, the President of the United States is critical and one of the most important players that Japan can engage with. But don't forget the rest of your friends. And I think Japan, I mean, we're literally watching today Shohei Ohtani destroy the Mets here in New York. And watching the soft power of Japan may seem very different than the security elements and the President of the United States. But if Shohei Ohtani and Shogun, that won 18 Emmys for the first time, can come together along with much of Japan's soft power, from food to arts, don't forget that you have enormous potential on the global stage, and don't reduce it only until these issues that I think that many times Japanese in a post-World War II environment forget and sometimes don't feel confident enough of on the global stage. I'm warning you, I'm telling you as a friend, we need you now more than ever.
Now we truly know that he's a president of the Japan Society. Yeah, who knows well and who cares a lot about Japan-US relationship. Let's take a couple of more, and I'll Glenn, come back to you with a question that has already been raised. Yes, please. The microphone will be there.
If you go back to the founding of the American Republic and George Washington's speech about avoiding entangling in alliances and staying out of Europe's wars, it's usually taken quite a lot to pull the United States into a world war or a foreign war. It took a lot to get us into World War I. It took a lot to get us into World War II on the side of the British, and very frankly, we didn't even come in until we were forced into a war. So there is a very, very powerful theme of isolationism, and while I celebrate, the Japan Society's president's enthusiasm for the relationship, I mean, over sake and behind closed doors, is there ever a discussion of how Japan would go it alone if for one reason or another the United States isn't prepared to engage in another Asian war?
Great point. Thank you very much. Any others who wish to join the discussion? Yes, Bill first, and then gentlemen.
I just wanted to add, I mean, I thought it was a fascinating point that Glenn made about Kamala Harris and how continuity might not be the right way to think about it, because this is a new person with a different background and so forth. And I wonder if if the panel could address a bit more about what would a President Harris be like, personally and in terms of her attitudes, including to Japan. I think would be very interesting to hear.
Thank you, Sergey Kaz Global Group. If Trump becomes president, how do you think Japan will reduce or increase the support towards Ukraine? Thank you.
Support on what?
Support towards Ukraine.
Ukraine. Okay, thank you very much. All right, so let's take a couple of questions. I think directed at Glen, and especially on the Kamala Harris questions and U.S. isolationism, if possible.
With regard to Kamala Harris, she's basically a lawyer. She was city attorney of San Francisco, attorney general of California for 8 years, senator for 4 years. As a senator, she really focused on being on the Intelligence Committee and on the Judiciary Committee. On Judiciary Committee, she was known to be very sharp in her questioning of Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr as attorneys general under Trump. And in the Brett Kavanaugh hearing for the Supreme Court nomination, she has some of the toughest questions. But when it comes to foreign affairs and when it comes to economic issues, she has not had much experience. So as I say, who's going to be advising her is going to be very important. But if you try to extrapolate from her experiences being in California and what the environment and I'm from California, so I know, and especially from San Francisco, okay? I know that environment. It's a very diverse and very open-minded, and Asia is very important. Plus, she spent 5 years in Montreal in a totally foreign environment where she was forced to speak French, which she didn't really want to do. And then she went to Harvard University. But except for those 5 years in Montreal and 4 years at Harvard University, all of her times in California. So my advice to Japan and others is to understand California better, because that is an area, and Richard Dasher is here, I think he'll agree with me, that it's a very different environment from the rest of the country. And I think that Kamala Harris will be shaped by that. So that's one piece of advice I would give. I want to make one comment on the question about unity. I think that if Donald Trump wins this time, unfortunately from my point of view, the divisions in the U.S. will increase. And the relations with allies will decrease. We'll get out of international organizations, so it will not be good for people who are interested in global society. On the other hand, if Donald Trump loses, I think that many Republicans will conclude they've lost 3 times with this guy. They lost 2020. In the 2022 midterm elections, the people he supported basically lost. 2024, he loses. So I think the Republicans will probably look for a new direction, whether it's Nikki Haley or Glen Youngkin, a different direction, which I think will probably, although people like J.D. Vance and others will try to carry on the torch of Trumpism, I think Republican Party itself may look in a different direction. So that's my hope.
So, Jagannath, I'd like to turn over to you because there was a question of U.S. isolationism that really matters to Europe transatlantic relationship as well, and India's the principal approach is the strategic autonomy, but this terminology has been shared among so many states in order to increase their capability and the capability for not denied by major powers. And that is also the growing notion in Europe, also icon by the French, but also by so many as well. But how do you feel that, U.S. engagement in the transatlantic relationship in Europe, and that might really be perceived by the European, experts, leading scholars, and the leaders?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Ken, and I wish I have a definite answer to your question. But my impression here in Europe is that I think Europe is largely divided, and they are not very clear whether Trump 2.0 is going to be any different or the same. So I think Europe is divided. But I think largely there is a consensus emerging that while Trump, if he's coming back to power, he might not really bring anything new. He might continue with his hawkish, more abrupt kind of policy approaches, but the world is already aware of that. So I think it will be much easier for the world to deal with that. And given the fact that Trump is having a very positive approach towards China and Russia, probably he might play a role in terms of stopping the war. So I think there the European communities are drawing inferences. Now, how is it really seen in India? I think in India sees that a good, stronger US-EU relationship is not entirely in India's interest. And I think, as you earlier pointed out, that at one point in Indian, strategic community, and also that involves a kind of thinking in some kind of official level, that probably India would like to see that US and EU stay divided, more divided, and which will give India a kind of a platform to engage and stay engaged with both the communities both the sides to at a separate level. And I would also like to bring your attention, which is a kind of a most important point from India's point of view. For many years, India is trying that we should have a annual leadership summit with the US, just like the way India used to have with India is having with Japan, and India is having for so many years with Russia, even though that has been disturbed. But from India's point of view, India wants to have its own standing in international affairs by having this leadership summit with the US. So we would like to see whether Democrats and the Republicans who would be eager to have this proposal accepted. I don't see Trump is going to accept that, going by Trump's approach. So that is not necessarily a good news. But while saying that, I think, as I mentioned earlier, India would not really like a united, stronger transatlantic ties because that is not in India's interest. Probably India would like to maintain a separate kind of a good relationship with the US, at the same time a good relationship with the EU, because both are seen at two different constituencies from where India is operating today.
That's wonderful, Jagannath. And the final question to you, Takako-san. That Ukraine was said on the the question, and I think that Ukraine is the most strategic important aspects in the European security affairs, and now how it played out and how you can really terminate the war in the preferential, I think, status of what the rule-based international order might prevail is the essence. But I don't know that whether that would be the only course that we can really take. And from the Japanese perspective, definitely that the rule-based international order is very important. We have really committed for the to increase the resiliency of the Ukraine forces, Ukraine government, and we also JICA and those development has started even during the war, and that's a great kind of I think parallel approach that Japan has been taking to Ukraine. But to answer his question about this, and how do you see that the things could play out in the years to come?
It's really hard to say because I think it's really contingent upon who wins in the U.S. Donald Trump has repeatedly promised he can end the war. And whatever that means, I don't know. And depending on how the war is ended, Ukraine is going to be in a very different place. And maybe other countries in Europe is going to be in a different place too. So I think it's hard to say what Japan can do given the uncertainty, but I think it's important that Japan continues to do what it does. That's a boring answer, but I think that's all we can say at this point. And I do think that Ukraine has been an awakening moment in the ways that we didn't expect in Japan. That I do think, as you mentioned, Ken, that Japan has been it's not just the turnaround in policy right after Ukraine happened, but also continuously investing or looking for opportunities to help in a way that we might have been reluctant to do. And so that, I think, is to be a steady partner in Asia, and to commit in a way that we do is the most important way forward for Ukraine.
Thank you very much. And we talk a lot about the election results and what's going to happen and what will be the implication for the world. But as Takako mentioned at her final comments, that events could overtake us. What's going to happen in Ukraine and also in Gaza, spill over to Iran. And then how much those events could have a strategic implication to other states will also be the structural question that we need to deal with. If those kind of things could happen, how much we are prepared. And that is together with the new government in the United States and the new government that will emerge in Japan will be the great question that we also need to keep updating. So the time is up, and I would like to thank everybody to joining this discussion, and thank you very much for all the panelists.